Hi, I'm Jeff Stark. Thanks for being with me today. We've been looking into great detail this matter of what the scriptures talk about in terms of a man leaving his mother and father, cleaving to his wife, and becoming one flesh. This is the 10th video in this series of videos titled Leaving, Cleaving, and Becoming One Flesh. We spent a lot of time talking about what it means to leave. We're not going to review that today. Secondly, in previous videos, we've looked at this idea of what it means to cleave, to glue, to be jointed together. And we discovered that that's a permanent term. It's like gluing pieces of wood. Interestingly, we notice that a husband and wife are cleaving to one another as they stand on the altar and make those promises to one another. Put a ring on the finger to symbolize that. We make vows and we're pronounced man and wife. And there's a marital kiss that inaugurates marital intimacy with each other. But secondly, also in addition to the cleaving going on between the husband and the wife at that point, at the wedding ceremony, something's going on behind the scenes, which I'll just barely make reference to right now. And it's in Matthew chapter 19 where it says, those whom God has brought together, those whom God has cleaved together, man must not separate. So surely those vows are to be faithful and to be good to one another are vows that husbands and wives are to fulfill. Having said those promises, God takes those very seriously. They are a lifetime of vows. But there's something going on behind the scenes, and that is that God is bringing these two people together, and he's causing them to be glued together as well. And there's a warning there, and that is those whom God has joined together, those whom God has glued together, man must not separate. Again, underlying the permanency of this relationship, the permanency of these promises, and there's more to be said about that. But in this 10th video, which is today, we're going to be looking at this matter very briefly about what it means to become one flesh. Now, there are two ways to interpret that, and we'd like to look at those two just real briefly today. So when it says a man will leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife and they become one flesh, one way to understand that, and it's a biblically accurate way to understand that, is that that husband and wife now begin this journey together to become, the two will become one. So over starting that day and probably somewhat perhaps before that, emotionally they are independent, but now they're going to be blending themselves together emotionally and the two will become one. Psychologically, independently, they will become one. Physically and sexually, surely they will become one. Intellectually become one. Financially, they will become one. And other ways as well. So there's a two people and all of their faculties now are going to leave being single, and now they're going to blend those faculties together and become one person. And that's what it means to become one flesh, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, financially, and certainly sexually and affectionately as well, and other ways. Okay, so that's what they do, when they come together in that way, they are giving up and walking away from their single life and their independence, and they are now coming together and forming a bond. And so it's no longer me, it's now we. There is a me, that we talked about in previous sessions, but now the two are becoming one, and they're becoming one in entirely, and with entirety, and that's what it means to become one flesh. Therefore, men and women should not act independently and as though they're single, okay? And men, for example, I will specifically talk to you about this. If you're choosing to get married and you have found a woman and you want to leave your life and cleave to her, then what you're going to have to leave behind is your singleness and your independence of being a single person. And getting married now, I leave my single ways behind, and now I'm blending myself together. And that's what I'm called to, and that's what I'm really committing myself to. But what does it mean to be one flesh? Well, that means I'm giving up my singleness. I'm blending myself together now with this wife, and with we are going to do life together now and not life separately from one another. Okay? If you're not ready to do that, men, if you're not ready to do that, wives, don't get engaged, don't get married. because that's what it really calls for. Now, one other thing before we look at the second way to interpret this matter of one fleshness. This permanency of this relationship of one fleshness through the gluing and the joining together is something that is meant to be permanent, and that's very scary to people. And so oftentimes, to eliminate the risks of getting married to someone who I might not be happy with, men and women are starting to live together and becoming one flesh without having gone to that wedding ceremony, and that is a very, very, very sinful thing to do. And we'll look more into that in the detail into further discussions and videos. But that is a very, very common thing that's taking place in my society at this point in time. Out of fear, men and women and the pleasures of becoming one flesh, they are coming together, they are living together, having sex together, blending themselves together, but not going to the marriage ceremony, not making those vows and promises. And what that really boils down to is, I want all the privileges of being one flesh, but I don't want to assume those responsibilities and commitments and vows, and so I'm going to forgo that. We're going to jump over that. We're going to forget that, ignore that, and just simply become one flesh. God says a man will leave his mother and father, cleave to his wife, and after having done those two things in that order, then they become one flesh. And to leave and to jump over and ignore the cleaving and become one flesh is a violation of that those words that are given to us in Genesis and Ephesians about leaving and cleaving and becoming one flesh. Okay, so one flesh means a lifetime of coming together and giving up my singlehood and living as a we and not independently in singleness like you would be able to do in singleness. There's another way to interpret this one fleshness. In this particular Genesis passage, to become one flesh, the Hebrew is in the perfect tense. And what that means is that this one fleshness is something that is done once and permanently. It's not a continuing thing that goes on. It's a one and a done kind of a thing. So how can we understand that when we talk about leaving and cleaving and becoming one flesh once and for all, one time and once and for all, or a one-time perfect tense, a one and done thing? Well, here's my understanding of that. Is what's called for is that in the wedding marriage there is a leaving, in the wedding there's a cleaving, and the one fleshness that is to be taking place, this one and done, is the one time that's done after the wedding ceremony. And so I think what that means is that following up that wedding ceremony, the husband, the new husband, and the new wife are to come together and they are to have sex with each other. They are to become one sexually with each other. Now, they'll be doing that for the rest of their marriage, but what this passage is really talking about is culminating this process of leaving and cleaving with the night of the wedding or the next day, with coming together sexually as a way of inaugurating what they're going to be doing many, many times. But this passage about becoming one flesh can also be interpreted as is the inauguration of that. You only inaugurate that once, and then you do it for the rest of your life. And so what this passage, I think, is really saying is that a man will leave his mother and father, cleave to his wife, and then immediately after the wedding, soon thereafter, they are going to culminate their marriage by inaugurating it with this sexual experience of having intercourse, which will inaugurate and bring this one fleshness together in a very demonstrative way. Looking at this another way is, if a man leaves his mother and father and cleaves to his wife, but they don't have sex with each other after that wedding ceremony, then they've not really inaugurated their marriage. There is something substantive that's missing, that's meant to be taking place soon after the wedding, and that is the sexual experience of having intercourse with each other, which you have with that new wife and that new husband, and you'll be having it thereafter, but it needs to be inaugurated soon after the wedding has taken place, and that solidifies the leaving and the cleaving and becoming one flesh as it relates to how those three things really play out with each other. I can remember quite some time ago that there was a man and woman who were husband and wife came to me for counseling quite some time ago. And the complaint on the part of the husband was that, well, we've been married for 2 years, but we've never had sex with each other. My wife just doesn't want to have sex. And the only thing I remember about that particular client, two clients, was this. They were members of a very prominent church and with a very prominent pastor, a preacher in the Philadelphia area. And so I called the preacher and I introduced myself and I said, this is what's going on. They're seeing me for counseling, and do you have some advice for them, as they've been married for 2 years, but they've not had sex yet? And I was rather surprised. I'd not ever heard this before, but the minister was very clear, and he was a biblical scholar for sure. And he said, well, they're not really officially married until they've had sex. And didn't quite understand how or why he could interpret it that way, but I trusted him. And these many years later, when I've come to understand this one fleshness is in the perfect tense, it means one and done. Well, you inaugurate that marriage one and done. That you can only inaugurate it once, but is that one fleshness that is said to be after you leave and cleave, they become one flesh. Well, there is a one and done inauguration that is to take place soon after the wedding. And if it does not take place, then it's not really been inaugurated, and that marriage is really not, in a biblical sense, a properly done marriage. So that's all we're going to say about this one flesh relationship. It is to be technically an act of intercourse soon thereafter the wedding, to inaugurate that marriage. To baptize that marriage, if we could use that. You're only baptized once. It happens after conversion. Well, after marriage, you inaugurate your marriage by the act of intercourse. It's one, it's done, it's official. Now you move on to be doing that for the rest of the duration of the marriage. I hope that's helpful. If you know a couple that might apply to, you certainly want to introduce them to this particular video, which is video number 10, titled Leave, Cleave, Become One Flesh, video number 10. We'll continue this with a couple more videos covering a little bit more territory, but I hope this is helpful for you.